Psst, check out my Patreon.
This is a Professor episode. That's probably all I need to say for you to get an idea of what I think about this one. Yes, it appears that we are in for yet another distasteful 11 minutes of Professor Utonium making a mockery of his former self and being the incompetent imbecile that I've come to hate and loathe. Gah, I know season 1 and 2 had some pretty bad professor-centric episodes, but they are nowhere near as mind-numbing as what I like to call the unholy trinity of season 3. First we had Quarantine, today we have Rebel, and don't even get me started on the third component that completes this trifecta. We aren't there yet, thankfully, but we will be soon enough. Needless to say, I am not going to sugarcoat anything in this review because I lost all of my patience for this reboot's attempts at portraying a proper father character all the way back in season 1. In today's short story, Professor Utonium meets up with a group of other scientists that don't look antagonistic in any way whatsoever, no, of course not, who are known as the Beaker Boys.
We're the
Beaker Boys.
Stop, we're not doing this, alright? I'm gonna review your episode, and then you're never gonna be heard from again as you fade away into obscurity because you're such basic characters that nobody even wants to remember. Okay? Okay. These so-called Beaker Boys invite the professor to join in on their little science charades without any ulterior motive whatsoever. I mean, just look at these character designs. Do they look like the kind of guys that would screw you over when you aren't looking? No, not at all. They're for totally innocent bystanders, aren't they? As a side note, this episode's title, Rebel, is a reference to a David Bowie song, which doesn't come as a surprise to me at all, considering David Bowie got a whole music video sequence dedicated to him in Home Sweet Homesick from season 2. How does the reference to the song tie into events of this episode? Quite frankly, I have no idea. I legitimately searched for every possible connection I could find. I analyzed the song's lyrics, I delved into the history of how Bowie came to write the song, I listened to the background music of the episode and tried to compare it to the song. I literally got so desperate for an answer that I had to ask you guys on my community tab and Twitter if any of you knew any connection between the song and title, and literally nobody else was able to provide anything either. So why the hell is this episode called Rebel? Because the professor isn't rebelling against anybody. Nobody ever places a restriction on him for him to rebel against. Sure, there are scientists that ignore him and his daughters aren't fond of him hanging out with the Beaker Boys, but nobody ever tells him outright that he can't spend time with him. There is not an opposing force for him to stand up against. And that goes for all the other characters too. Nobody is rebelling in this episode against anything. And not once is drag present at all either, which is what the original song was about. So yeah, I fail to see a connection. I seriously struggled to figure out why this episode was given the name Rebel, but it appears to me that there is no reason. Unless somebody watching this review has a solid concrete answer, but then I'd only wish we communicated before I put out this video, you know? Oh well, without further delay, let's begin with the second entry in the unholy trinity of season 3.
Step right up to see the most incredible, most outrageous, most out-of-this-world way to log and process your data.
The episode opens with an establishing shot of what I'm assuming to be the Townsville Convention Center, where ScienceCon is currently being held. The professor is here with his latest invention, the Data Cruncher. Yeah, that's not a very exciting invention name now, is it? The other scientists present sure seem to think so. Oh, hey, look, it's famous science people. I know them. Cool. So right out the gate, I'd just like to throw out that I'm fairly certain this episode's entire reason for existing was because it just wanted to make an episode about the professor and science. That's literally all this episode serves to show us. The professor likes science. Hell, I'd be willing to bet the reboot had these ideas drawn out of a hat full of sticky notes, and for this particular week, the two notes that were pulled literally just read the professor and science. As somebody with a background in physics, I do not see an ounce of genuine passion for the subject of science anywhere in this episode. In fact, this is so surface level that it couldn't even provide a good reason for the scientists not liking the professor's creation. Truth be told, if the professor did create a super efficient system that made data analysis easier figure, scientists would be all over that because it would increase analysis capability, data capacity, and the efficiency of acquiring results. You can never go wrong with improving your efficiency. A better reason for the scientist not being interested in his presentation would be for the professor's experiment to not actually achieve anything meaningful or groundbreaking, or for it to be a step backwards from the technology already available amongst other scientists at the convention. Hell, even this being a carbon copy of somebody else's work would have been more legitimate to warrant this kind of response. The episode never outright states whether his data cruncher is a superior new model or not, but what it does say is that it is an out-of-this-world way to log and process your data. The episode just chalks this up to, it's boring, without any more elaboration than that. And can we talk about the fact that the episode that came right before this, Hustle Cup, we saw the professor preparing for a science convention with his stop hat. Why the heck isn't he showing that off instead? That would have been a great tie-in to the episode prior, and we've already seen the show reference other episodes in other episodes, so why couldn't it have done the same here? I'm not sure if this was intended to be the very next episode after Hustle Cup, seeing as this doesn't appear to be the same science con that he was preparing for in that episode, which was known as Science Palooza. This con here is just generic Science Con, and what gets me even more is that there was another con in Lights Out, known as Towntopia, which for whatever reason the professor didn't participate in. Wonder why there are so many cons this season when there were barely any in the prior two. Oh, and there's also a science fair coming up in just a few more episodes too, which is worth considering adding to the pile. Well, after all the scientists abandon the professor because he's whiny and annoying, Wendy Q. Dallin shows up with a different voice actress to just shrug him off in pure apathy.
Oh, hey, hi! Want to learn about my data logging technique?
No. I left my purse.
Oh.
Kinda undermines the positive persona the show gave her in Home Sweet Homesick. Here she's just being rude, although I'm sure the real reason why she showed up here was just because she was an easy model to reuse. Still, considering she was built up to be the super caring role model for Blossom, only to have her show so much apathy to the professor in this scene is a contradiction to what we know of her that I'm sure the show wasn't even thinking about when it did this. The professor mopes by himself for a short time until this ragtag bunch of schmucks show up and introduce themselves.
The Beaker Boys, Joe, Mo, Elbow, and Hieronymus Base.
So here we have Joe, Mo, Elbow, and Hieronymus Base. Joe exists purely to say that he likes stuff. Elbow is kind of the brawn, but not really, and has the second most speaking lines. Mo literally has no reason to exist. And Hieronymus Base may as well be the only character present because the former three I just went through don't do much of anything to enhance this story. They add nothing to the plot, and Hieronymus Base does all the talking. This group is just one character represented by 4 people, and while that can work in some contexts, the sheer lack of purpose that everyone except Hieronymus exhibits make me think it should have just been one character instead of needlessly splitting them up into 4 all so they could sing a stupid song about being called the Beaker Boys. In fact, I guarantee you that the name and concept of these guys was made up first and the personalities came later. Or lack thereof, I should say. These guys are about as one note as the moral the episode ends up trying to push at the end. The professor, being the moron that can't make up his mind on what he actually wants, is immediately enthralled by these guys. So in essence, his motivation just changed from wanting to present his science project to everybody to wanting cool science friends. Next, we get a montage of the professor and the Beaker Boys, which is such a lame and unfunny name by the way, blowing stuff up with chemicals because that's this group's entire appeal. Apparently they're famous or something according to Blossom because she makes one side comment about them blowing stuff up on TV, but this supposed TV show is barely acknowledged at all, so I'm not really sure. I mean, I suppose you could argue that the opening montage where they introduce themselves is the opening to their show, but there's really no indication that says that's the case. I personally just thought it was how they were being introduced by Tom Kenny. All you really need to know about this supposed show is that they're essentially the Michael Bay of the daytime television chemistry world. Speaking of Blossom, the professor brings the Beaker Boys home later that night and introduces them to the girls.
You gotta meet my new friends, the Beaker Boys.
This is the second time we have to hear them do this introduction. Thankfully, the rule of 3 does not apply here for once, otherwise we'd have to consider this a running gag.
Professor, it's great to be friends with people who are interested in the same things as you. But are you sure those guys are the kind of friends you want?
Okay, so I completely understand what this show is trying to do here, but it could be way better. So in essence, after seeing them enter the room and blow up their couch, the girls are quick to judge these guys and call the professor into the kitchen because they don't think these are the kinds of people he should be hanging around with. I mean, how much do they really know about these guys to know they're bad news? Are they just judging them based off of their looks? Because while their designs indicate that they are not pure individuals and that it's impossible to not see their betrayal coming from a mile away, it does make Blossom look like a shitty person in universe, given what we already know the girls are aware of. But the professor doesn't pay them any mind anyways, because even though he claims he's their father and is fully capable of making reasonable decisions as an adult, he's actually the child here while the girls are the adults in the episode. Thankfully, not to the extent of professor-proofed, but in a more figurative sense. What I think bothers me most of all is what Buttercup has to contribute to the conversation, however.
What do you mean, honey?
All they do is blow stuff up!
Which is good for me as a friend, but I gotta agree with Blossom here.
Oh, okay, I see how it is. It's okay when she does it, but if another character does it, then she frowns at them. Yeah, why does Buttercup agree with Blossom here? Buttercup is literally in favor of the Beaker Boys because they are her kinds of people, and yet still sides with Blossom because... well, just because. Buttercup directly acknowledges that this goes against her character and conforms to Blossom's side anyways because the episode just has to have it go that way so that it can tell us that peer pressure bad. Why even have this line here? Bubbles doesn't ever say anything in this scene, why not have her chime in instead of Buttercup? But even if Buttercup had to say something here, this could have been a great moment for her to be offering up a different perspective and telling Blossom she shouldn't just jump to conclusions based on the way people look. Well, I suppose it doesn't really matter because we see that the girls were right about him being peer pressured into doing things that he may not want to do, as the Beaker Boys try to convince him to blow up a mailbox because once again that's the only trait these characters have. He caves into their peer pressure, and next we get a montage of the professor and the Beaker Boys blowing more stuff up together in the professor's home lab. That's another thing. Rebel really wants to make it clear that the professor has a home lab.
I was running an experiment in my home lab.
You have that lab in your house?
And you got a lab in your house.
Pretty sweet lab you got here, Professor. So we could steal your lab.
Steal my lab? If only I had my lab.
Those mean guys still got away with your lab.
It's almost like this episode is forcing you to recognize that the professor having a home lab is going to be important or something. After some more quality Beaker Boy bonding time, the 5 of them are seen in Utonium's lab where they tell him they're considering adding him to their group permanently if he can complete one more itsy bitsy task for them.
Use this cool lab here to make a monster.
I don't know about that.
Maybe this will change your mind.
Oh, my own Beaker Boy lab coat!
I don't know if a lab coat should really be the incentive that acts as the deciding factor for the professor to create this monster, considering how Hustlecup established he has a closet full of them, but I mean, what do I know, right? It's probably just the fact that it's a Beaker Boy official lab coat and that makes it special. However, when evaluating the information we've been presented throughout the episode, it's difficult to understand why the professor actually wants to hang out with these guys. Literally, the only experience we have to judge the professor's enjoyment with this squad of scientists is him blowing up a mailbox, which we could see clear discomfort coming from him as he was peer pressured into doing it, and then a montage that cuts out any actual interaction between these characters. As with 90% of the show, the episode just expects its audience to mindlessly ignore the blatant flaws because it's more concerned with sticking to its moral and message rather than focusing on making the idea work. It's the same thing as an engineer just going up and building a bridge without actually calculating, measuring, and evaluating the integrity and design of the structure. If you don't plan it out and reinforce all of the weak points, it's going to collapse. Nothing convinces me that the professor would actually want to be around these guys because they're jerks who act out and have nothing in common with him. But because the episode just has to force in a message about peer pressure, the professor is written to go along with it and want to be with them anyways. Ultimately, he does end up creating a giant eyeball monster with tentacles that also seems to be lacking creativity considering this sort of design has been done to death countless times. Not to mention the fact that the original series also had a giant floating eyeball eyeball monster that shot lasers out of its eyes, and its design was actually reflective of the entire point of the episode. Like, the entire reason that episode featured an eyeball monster was to really emphasize the significance of what it was trying to say. But maybe I'll get into why the main event is such a brilliant episode another day. The reboot only wishes it could come close to that. The girls shake their heads at the professor in shame and go off to fight the foul creature, while the professor is met with an alarming realization when the Beaker Boys approach him.
You had me create that monster to destroy my girls.
No, we had you created to get your girls out of the way so we could steal your lab.
Wow, totally didn't see that one coming. You mean the characters that clearly don't look evil at all were evil the whole time? Yeah, so the professor gets his lab stolen and the girls get their asses kicked until the professor recalls that he has an old chemistry set from his childhood upstairs.
There you are. My first childhood chemistry set. One precisely measured drop. Yay!
Perfectly intact, mind you. The chemicals were never touched before, and this is somehow capable of creating a giant sponge monster. So either people are actually capable of creating sentient life just by buying a kit off of a store shelf in the Powerpuff Girls reboot, or the professor had other supplies present that he didn't acknowledge that allowed him to do this. Either way, his sponge monster creation jumps on the eyeball, and after an explosion that really has no cause, destroys the city and fizzles out, we see that the two have combined into one peaceful creature, bringing events to a close. Well, except for the fact that the professor's home lab is still in the hands of the Beaker Boys.
Don't worry, girls. I have a friend taking care of it.
We're gonna blow up dynamite!
Oh, guess it's a happy ending after all. Well, except for the Beaker Boys, who likely fell to their deaths. We never see him again, so it's only fair to assume. And that sums up Rebel Rebel. Yeah, I don't like it, but it's a professor episode, so is that really a surprise? At the very least, the professor isn't reckless towards his daughters, but he's still a shit character that I cannot stand watching. And throughout this entire episode, I don't know what his motivation is supposed to be. First he wants to talk science, then he wants friends because he's lonely, then he wants to be in a gang, then he wants a lab coat, then he wants to save the day, then he wants his lab back and get revenge on the Beaker Boys. Like, can we just stick to one or two ideas, please? And the Beaker Boys didn't need to be 4 characters. I mean, the way they even show up on screen positions them to look like they are just one large character anyways. Why have these separate guys if one just likes stuff, one is tall, one is the main guy, and the other provides literally nothing? I'm not even kidding. Mo has zero purpose to exist. He doesn't do anything. And the sheer amount of talking down to the audience that this episode does too is just saddening. Between Blossom spelling out the entire moral to Hieronymus Base over-explaining the antagonist's evil scheme, it honestly treats the audience like they're idiots who lack basic comprehension skills. Why does this show constantly feel the need to tell us the moral it's trying to preach? The entire point of art is that it's meant to be interpreted. When the show forces its audience to listen to this one idea and require them to stick to this path because there are no other interpretations possible, it ruins any chance of the individual viewer developing their own personal connection to it. This isn't telling us a story, this is giving us a lecture. This is why I liked Bubbles the Blue so much, because that was an episode that didn't just outright say, hey, this is what the episode is saying. It left it open to the viewer to inflect their own personal interpretations onto the story. That is what made that episode so much more beneficial compared to this. Gosh, I just can't stand it when this reboot tries to be preachy because it doesn't even have the basic decency to consider its content. The hierarchy of priorities in this show looks like this: moral, montages, running gag, the professor being an idiot, random nonsense, literally anything else except for the following below: story, characters, action. But I've had just about enough of this Rebel debate, so I think I'm gonna end things off here. Luckily, we're in the home stretch now, as there are less than 10 episodes left before the reboot is over and done with. Oh boy, I can't wait.